The Bible contains numerous stories that impart deep lessons about life, faith, and morality. However, some of these tales are so troubling that they are often left unspoken, particularly those involving sexual sin. These disturbing events are not only illustrations of immoral actions, but also serve as records of the devastating aftermath that followed. Prepare yourself to learn about 7 biblical accounts that demonstrate how lust and sexual immorality can wreak havoc on individuals, families, and even entire cities. What you are about to discover is both shocking and a powerful warning of how deviating from God's laws can lead to complete destruction. We begin with one of the most infamous places in biblical history, Sodom, a city synonymous with moral decay. In Sodom, sin and depravity weren't just common. They were openly embraced. It was a place where God's laws were scoffed at, and unspeakable acts were carried out without shame. The city's culture revolved around unrestrained indulgence, with no regard for moral boundaries. The young were exploited, families were torn apart, and any respect for sacred principles had vanished entirely. The most famous account of Sodom's depravity comes from the night 2 angels sent by God visited Lot's home. Upon their arrival, Lot graciously welcomed them and insisted they stay at his house, knowing the streets of Sodom were dangerous. He pleaded with them, "Do not stay in the square," for he knew the wickedness that lurked there. As night descended, Sodom's true nature emerged. A mob of men, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house, demanding that his visitors be handed over to them for their wicked purposes. This terrifying scene revealed just how deep the city had sunk into immorality. Lot, in desperation, tried to reason with the mob, begging them not to commit such vile acts, but his words were met with mockery. The situation escalated, and the angels, seeing the danger, pulled Lot inside and struck the men outside with blindness. This was the final evidence that Sodom had crossed all moral boundaries and could no longer be spared. At dawn, the angels instructed Lot and his family to flee the city immediately, as God's judgment was imminent. On that same day, fire and brimstone rained down from the heavens, obliterating Sodom, Gomorrah, and everything in their vicinity. Homes, people, and even the surrounding vegetation. It was a severe act of divine justice, serving as an eternal reminder that God does not overlook sin. Even during the escape, Lot's wife, disobeying the command not to look back, was turned into a pillar of salt, symbolizing the irreversible fate of those who choose a life of sin. Another disturbing story follows the aftermath of Sodom's destruction. Lot's daughters, fearing that the human race had been annihilated, were overcome with desperation. Influenced by the corrupt culture of Sodom, they devised a plan to intoxicate their father and engage in incestuous acts to preserve their family lineage. This shocking decision highlights how life in a morally decayed society can warp people's judgment. The consequences of their actions were far-reaching. Both daughters gave birth to sons who became the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, nations that would become enemies of Israel, spiritually and militarily. The story of Lot's daughters underscores how poor choices can have lasting effects, impacting future generations. Continuing through the Bible, we encounter another grim episode during the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. After being freed from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites were repeatedly instructed to obey God's commandments. Yet, in a moment of weakness, many of them succumbed to temptation when Moabite women seduced them into not only sexual immorality but also idolatry. What started as harmless social interactions quickly spiraled into a grave national sin. The men of Israel participated in pagan rituals dedicated to Baal, the fertility god, violating God's laws. As a result, a deadly plague swept through the camp, killing thousands. It took the bold action of Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, to stop the plague by executing a couple that was openly defying God's holiness. This episode shows how unchecked sin can lead to widespread destruction if not addressed swiftly. In yet another dark Old Testament story, we see how sexual violence leads to devastating consequences in the case of the Levite and his concubine in Gibeah. The Levite and his concubine were journeying through the land when they sought refuge in Gibeah, a city of the Benjamites. Instead of receiving hospitality, they were met with indifference. That night, A mob of wicked men surrounded the house where they were staying, demanding the Levite be handed over to them for abuse. In a desperate attempt to protect his guest, the elderly host offered his own daughter and the Levite's concubine to the crowd. Tragically, the Levite, in a cowardly act, gave his concubine to the men. She was brutally assaulted and found dead at the doorstep the next morning. Enraged, the Levite dismembered her body and sent pieces to the tribes of Israel, demanding justice. This heinous act sparked a civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of Israel, nearly resulting in the annihilation of the Benjamites. The story of Gibeah serves as a sobering reminder of how moral collapse can tear apart communities and incite brutal violence. Lastly, even within the royal family of Israel, we find a tragic story of lust and betrayal. King David, known as a man after God's own heart, faced personal and familial turmoil due to sins rooted in lust. The most infamous case involves Amnon, David's eldest son, who developed an unhealthy obsession with his half-sister Tamar. Consumed by desire, Amnon pretended to be ill and tricked Tamar into attending to him. Once alone with her, he overpowered and raped her, shattering her purity and honor. This horrific act set off a chain of events that would lead to even greater suffering within David's household. What had once been desire quickly transformed into hatred, and in his bitterness, he humiliated her by banishing her from his presence. Tamar, devastated and heartbroken, tore her garments and covered herself in ashes, a traditional sign of mourning and shame. Her brother, Absalom, upon learning of the incident, took her into his care and quietly began plotting his revenge. David, although enraged when he heard what had happened, took no action against Amnon, possibly because Amnon was his eldest son and the heir to the throne. This inaction from David sparked Absalom's desire to take matters into his own hands. 2 years later, during a feast, Absalom ordered his servants to kill Amnon, thus avenging his sister's disgrace. This act of vengeance had lasting consequences, as Amnon's death caused a deep rift between David and Absalom. Absalom fled and spent years in exile. Upon his return, he led a rebellion against his father, attempting to seize the throne. This civil war nearly tore the kingdom of Israel apart, and in the end, Absalom was killed, leaving David shattered by grief. This series of tragic events reveals how Amnon's sin set off a chain of devastating consequences that scarred Israel's royal family. Another dark episode linked to sexual immorality occurs during the era of the Judges when Israel had no king. Each tribe lived independently, often straying from God's commandments, turning to idolatry and immorality. One of the most striking incidents from this period involved the Israelites' sin with the Moabite women during their journey through the wilderness. Fearing Israel's advance, Balak, the king of Moab, hired the prophet Balaam to curse the Israelites. However, God intervened, preventing Balaam from doing so. Frustrated, Balak devised another plan, sending Moabite women to seduce the Israelite men into participating in idolatrous rituals and acts of sexual immorality. The men of Israel, enticed by the allure of these women, joined them in these immoral practices, bowing to Baal and abandoning their covenant with God. God's wrath was kindled, and a plague spread through the camp, killing thousands. Moses, following God's command, ordered the execution of the guilty leaders. Meanwhile, the plague continued until Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, took decisive action by killing an Israelite man and a Midianite woman who were openly defying God's holiness. This act of zeal stopped the plague, and Phinehas was rewarded with a covenant of perpetual peace for his descendants. In total, 24,000 people died due to this sin. This story serves as a stark reminder of how unchecked temptation can lead to collective destruction. These biblical stories are more than historical accounts. They serve as timeless warnings about the dangers of sexual immorality and its devastating consequences. Though we live in a different time, temptations remain, and the principles set by God continue to hold relevance. May we learn from these stories and strive to live by the values God has established, avoiding the path of destruction that many before us have walked. The story of David and Bathsheba offers another powerful example of temptation and its consequences. Even a man after God's own heart, like David, was not immune to human weakness. It all began one quiet afternoon when David, while walking on his palace terrace, spotted Bathsheba bathing. Overcome with desire, David ordered her to be brought to him, despite knowing she was married to Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers. Their illicit affair led to a pregnancy, and in an attempt to cover his sin, David recalled Uriah from battle, hoping he would spend the night with his wife. But Uriah, loyal to his comrades still fighting on the front lines, refused. Frustrated, David made a fateful decision. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield with instructions to place him in the most dangerous position. Uriah was killed, and David married Bathsheba. Although David believed he had hidden his sin from men, he could not hide it from God. The prophet Nathan confronted him, using a parable to reveal the gravity of his actions. David, filled with remorse, sought God's forgiveness. However, the consequences of his sin were harsh. The child born from his affair with Bathsheba died, and turmoil never left his house. David's story serves as a reminder that while God is merciful and forgives the truly repentant, sin always has consequences. This is further illustrated in the story of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two priests, who were supposed to be examples of holiness, instead used their positions to exploit and corrupt. They stole from the offerings and engaged in immoral acts with the women serving at the tabernacle. Eli, their father, knew of their wrongdoing but failed to correct them, leading to God's judgment. In a battle with the Philistines, Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured. Upon hearing the news, Eli, overwhelmed by grief, fell from his chair and died. These biblical accounts show how sin can destroy not only individuals but entire families and nations. Lust, sexual violence, and spiritual corruption brought pain and devastation to God's people. However, these stories also highlight God's mercy for those who genuinely repent. If there's one lesson to take from these narratives, it is the importance of remaining steadfast in faith and God's principles. While the world and its temptations change, the nature of sin and its consequences remain the same.